So how can you tell if something at the United Nations is a bad idea? Well, you may want to look at which other countries are involved. If countries like Syria or North Korea or Venezuela are involved, you may want to second guess why it is that your country is getting involved. Now, that apparently is not something that Justin Trudeau does because he just had Canada vote in support of a resolution sponsored by all three of those countries. Now, on the face of it, that resolution seems innocuous, but I'll explain to you why it is problematic. It called for the creation of a Palestinian state and the support for Palestinian self-determination. But there are a couple of problems with this. Firstly, there have already been, and there are, a number of resolutions supporting the right of self-determination for all peoples. So you have to wonder why this one specifically about the Palestinian people. Secondly, the resolution itself makes absolutely no mention of Jews or even Israelis. It simply talks about the Palestinians. But for Israelis, for Jews, the land of Israel is inseparable from their identity. If you are a Jew, it is simply not possible to disassociate yourself, especially if you're a practicing Jew, to disassociate yourself from the land itself. And it's not about the political state, it's just about the land, which in the Bible, in Torah, is called Israel, and so we'll just refer to it as Israel. There are a number of commandments given to the Jewish people by God in the Bible, and a number of them can only be performed in that land. All of the holy spaces, the holy sites, the ancient burial grounds, all of these things are all in Israel. The fact that Jews pray towards Jerusalem 3 times a day, the fact that we long to return as a Jewish people, you long to return to the state of Israel to once again rebuild and self-govern in your own land. That is an integral part of Judaism, and you cannot separate the two as much as people want to try and say that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I'm very sorry. If you support the right of every other people to have self-determination, such as the Palestinian people, but you do not support the right of the Jewish people to have self-determination in their own indigenous homeland, then you simply have a problem with Jews. Now, 2 other things that I want to go over about the United Nations. Firstly, the United Nations is going to have a number of resolutions this year in the General Assembly. They have resolutions. They're non-binding. They're kind of like motions or statements. 17 will be about Israel, and 7 will be on the rest of the world combined. So even if you think Israel is a terrible place and it does terrible things, are you really telling me that it is 2/3 more terrible than the rest of the world combined? That's really not logically consistent, and you have a serious problem if that is what you think. Secondly, the United Nations Human Rights Council's agenda. They have an agenda for every meeting. Agenda item 7 is to specifically discuss the human rights situation in Palestine. So basically in Israel, what Israel is doing bad. Now, again, you're telling me that every meeting you have to talk about this, that there's absolutely nothing more pressing, or maybe it is really pressing and you should talk about it, but it's the only country that has a permanent agenda item. There's nothing going on in, Syria, China, somewhere in Africa. There's nothing going on in, Latin America, North America. There's nothing going on anywhere in the rest of the world that is deserving of a permanent agenda item or even a semi-permanent agenda item. Nothing at all. Seriously problematic. Now, lastly, before we wrap up, I just want to go over a bit of the history of the region and explain to you about why there is a conflict in the first place. There is a conflict because in 1947, at the end of the British Mandate, the British controlled that region and they were supposed to help it along until it was able to self-govern. That's what a mandate was. When the British abandoned that region in 1947, the Jewish people and Jews owned a percentage of the land. It was a relatively small percentage, granted, but they owned and legally purchased or had always lived there on a percentage of the land. And yet when the United Nations and all the other countries got together to say, okay, let's divide up this land somehow, the Arab leadership at the time said absolutely no. They are not willing to divide it up in any way, shape, or form. They do not accept any Jewish self-determination or any Jewish governance in that land, regardless of the borders. So though this is not about 1967, this is not about 1948, this is not about any occupation of any sort, this is simply about the original refusal of Arab leadership to accept any Jewish presence of self-determination in that region. That is where we started. If they would have accepted such a thing, maybe there would have been a tiny state. Maybe there would have still been wars. Maybe there would have still been conflict. But the entire issue started from a refusal by Arab leadership at the time to accept the Jewish people's self-determination in that land, and that is still going on as seen and evidenced by the text of this resolution. So I can make an entire video and talk for 10 hours about that, but in a nutshell, that is basically the issue. The Jewish people's indigenous homeland is the land of Israel. It cannot be separated from the Jewish people as a whole, cannot be separated from Judaism as a whole, and the entire issue is simply about delegitimizing the Jewish people's claim to that land, delegitimizing and disconnecting their connection from that land, and that is simply not something that we can accept. And as a Canadian, it is not something that I would like to see my country vote with Syria, Venezuela, and North Korea on one-sided resolutions. I really think we all need to be more upset about this because this was a long-standing policy that the Prime Minister seems to have reversed. Canada voted against a number of these resolutions, and he has decided to sort of reverse this stance, and that is something that Canadians should be outraged about. But please let me know in the comments if you'd like me to make a more in-depth video about the conflict. I'd be happy to cover it in the most fair and balanced way that I know how. And other than that, I hope you learned something about the United Nations and the history of Israel and the Middle East. But again, for True North, I am Sam Eskenasi. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourselves a great day.